Hey guys, tonight we are drifting back, ever so gently, to a world of drawing rooms and dances, of country estates and whispered confidences, all elegantly captured by the quill of Jane Austen. We're going to be exploring the surprisingly intricate and utterly essential practice of letter writing in Regency England. Imagine yourself for a moment, not scrolling through your phone, but seated at a delicate little writing desk, candlelight flickering, the only sound the scratch of a nib on paper as you pour out your thoughts, news, or perhaps a carefully worded invitation. This isn't just about pretty handwriting. This was the lifeblood of communication, the silken thread that connected hearts and minds across miles of muddy roads. We'll be unfolding the rules, the rituals, and the sheer quiet drama of the written word in an age before instant anything. Honestly, with the level of detail we're about to get into regarding postal rates and paper quality, you probably won't survive this awake, that is, which is, of course, our aim. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, do drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always a delight to see how far these sleepy stories spread. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself stepping into early 19th century England, the period often called the Regency, though it technically only lasted from 1811 to 1820. But for our purposes, think of that broader Jane Austen era, from the late 1790s through to her passing in 1817, and a little beyond. It's a world where travel is slow and often arduous. No quick train journeys or budget airlines to whisk you from one county to another. A trip from London to Bath, a popular spa town, could take the better part of a day by stagecoach, bouncing along less than perfect roads. News, therefore, traveled at the same leisurely pace. There were newspapers, certainly, but for personal tidings, for the intimate exchanges that build relationships and manage social lives, the letter was paramount. It was the Regency equivalent of your texts, emails, social media DMs, and video calls, all rolled into one, but with a whole lot more effort and a significant delay. In a society where personal connections, family alliances, and social standing were incredibly important, especially for the gentry and the burgeoning middle classes depicted in Austen's novels, letters were not just a nicety, they were a fundamental necessity. Think of Elizabeth Bennet receiving news from her Aunt Gardiner about Lydia's scandalous elopement, or Captain Wentworth's heart-stopping, hastily scribbled note to Anne Elliot in Persuasion. These weren't just casual updates. They were life-altering communications, conveyed through the fragile medium of paper and ink. Letter writing was, therefore, a crucial social skill. Young ladies, in particular, were expected to be adept at composing elegant, well-expressed, and grammatically correct letters. It was as much a part of their education as needlework or playing the pianoforte. The very act of receiving a letter was an event. Imagine the anticipation as the post arrived, perhaps carried by a liveried servant if you were grand, or collected from the local post office. Whose hand would it be and what news would it contain? A long-awaited reply from a dear friend, an invitation to a ball, a summons home, or perhaps a carefully penned declaration of affection. The emotional weight these folded sheets of paper carried could be immense. And the wait. Oh, the agony of waiting for a reply that might take days or even weeks, depending on the distance and the efficiency of the mails. We complain if a text isn't answered in 5 minutes. Imagine waiting a fortnight to know if your carefully phrased proposal of marriage, or just for a country walk, has been accepted. You'd have chewed your quill to a stump by then. Historians still argue the precise literacy rates across different classes during this period, but it's clear that for those who could read and write, letters formed a vital connective tissue of society. They maintained family bonds when siblings and children moved away for marriage, education, or careers. They facilitated commerce, conveyed political news, and, of course, played a starring role in courtship. A gentleman couldn't just slide into a lady's DMs. He had to compose a letter, perhaps agonizing over every word, acutely aware that his written expression would be judged as much as his fortune or his dancing ability. Breaking news from 3 weeks ago might have been the standard for gossip traveling by post, but it was still eagerly consumed and shared. Beyond the everyday, letters could also carry secrets. While not exactly common for your average country gentlewoman, the use of invisible ink, sympathetic inks made from things like lemon juice, milk, or more complex chemical concoctions that would only reveal their message when heated or treated, was known during this period, particularly in the world of diplomacy and espionage. Imagine a clandestine correspondence, the seemingly blank page holding hidden meanings. More commonly, for a touch of personal intimacy, small and flat tokens might be enclosed within a letter, a pressed flower, a snippet of ribbon, or even a lock of hair, adding a tangible, sentimental dimension to the written words. It's a far cry from an emoji, isn't it? The sheer effort involved in correspondence also lent it a certain gravity. There was no backspace key. Mistakes meant rewriting, or careful corrections that might mar the appearance of the sheet. Paper itself wasn't as cheap or plentiful as it is for us today, so every inch was often precious, a topic we'll delve into much more deeply later. The whole process, from trimming your quill to melting the wax for the seal, demanded time and attention. This inherent deliberateness meant that letters were often kept, reread, and treasured. They were records of relationships, chronicles of family life, tangible links to absent loved ones. Austen's own surviving letters to her sister Cassandra, though heavily edited by later generations, provide an invaluable, intimate glimpse into her daily life, her sharp observations, and her deep affection for her family. So, as you settle back, picture this world. A world where words traveled slowly but carried immense weight. A world where the arrival of the post could be the most exciting moment of the day, and where the ability to express oneself clearly and elegantly on paper was a mark of refinement and education. It was a gentle art, this correspondence, but one that underpinned the entire social fabric of Jane Austen's England. And we're just beginning to unfold its many layers. You're now settled into that Regency mindset we evoked in our last section, understanding just how vital those folded pieces of paper were, those lifelines of communication in Jane Austen's world. But before a single word of witty observation or heartfelt sentiment could be committed to the page, you needed the right tools. So, let's draw closer to that elegant little writing desk, perhaps lit by the soft glow of a flickering candle on this quiet evening. Much like it might be for you right now, wherever you're listening from. We're about to explore the essential and sometimes surprisingly temperamental paraphernalia of the dedicated letter writer, the quills, the ink, the paper, and all the little accoutrements that made correspondence possible. Forget your smooth gliding ballpoints or your effortless keyboards. The star of the show, the primary writing instrument of the era, was the quill pen. And this is a mainstream historical fact. These were most commonly made from the flight feathers of a goose, though swan feathers were prized for finer work, and crow feathers could be used for very delicate lines. Preparing a quill was an art in itself. You couldn't just pluck a feather and start writing. Oh no, that would be far too simple. The feather first had to be cured, often by hardening it in heated sand or ashes, then stripped of its barbs near the writing end, and most importantly, expertly cut to create a nib. This involved shaping the tip and slitting it carefully to allow ink to flow in a controlled manner. And because the nib would wear down with use, every writer needed a good penknife, not just to sharpen their quills initially, but to recut and maintain that point frequently. You thought sharpening a classroom pencil was a bit of a chore. Imagine having to perform minor surgery on a feather every half hour or so just to keep your words flowing. It demanded patience and a steady hand. One wrong cut and your quill was ruined. Or worse, it would sputter and blot, turning your carefully composed declaration of undying affection into something resembling a very unfortunate Rorschach test. Next, you'd need ink. This wasn't conveniently available in disposable cartridges. The most common type for everyday use was iron gall ink, a dark purplish black or brownish black ink made from iron salts and tannic acids extracted from oak galls, those little abnormal growths you see on oak trees. It was durable, permanent, and became darker as it oxidized on the paper, which was great for longevity. However, it was also acidic and could eventually eat through the paper over centuries. A conservator's nightmare. Lampblack ink, made from soot, was another option, offering a deep black and colored inks, though less common for everyday letters, were available. The exact recipes and availability of various colored inks beyond basic black or brown for personal correspondence in middle-class households. Perhaps a genteel lady wishing for a dash of blue to match her ribbons, remain a topic of some discussion among material culture historians. Some inks were homemade and designed with recipes often including rather surprising ingredients like wine, vinegar, or even gum arabic to bind the pigment. You can almost smell that slightly metallic, earthy scent of fresh iron gall ink, a fragrance lost to most of us today. Your ink would be kept in an inkwell, which could range from a simple ceramic pot to an elaborate silver or glass affair, often with a lid to prevent evaporation and spillage, and a constant threat to any neatly written page. And then, of course, there was the paper. In Austen's time, paper was made from cotton and linen rags, not wood pulp, which actually made it very durable if well kept. You'd encounter two main types laid paper, which had a slightly ribbed texture from the wires of the mold used to make it, and wove paper, which was smoother, a newer invention favored for its more uniform surface, especially for printing and finer writing. Paper was not an insignificant expense. It was sold by the quire 24 or 25 sheets, or the ream 20 quires. The quality varied, from rougher sorts used for wrapping or ephemeral notes, to finer, heavier paper for important correspondence or for keeping in bound letter books. The cost of paper, combined with postal charges based on the number of sheets which we'll get to later, is one reason why people tried to cram so much onto a single page, leading to practices like the infamous crossed letter. Every blank space was an opportunity, or perhaps an obligation, to add just one more thought. Once your letter was written once with your carefully cut quill and your meticulously chosen ink, you couldn't just fold it up and send it off. The ink needed to dry, and since iron gall ink could take a little while, and you didn't want to smudge your hard work, you'd use a drying agent. One common method was to sprinkle fine sand or pounce of powder made from cuttlefish bone, gum sandarac, or other materials over the wet ink. This would absorb the excess moisture, and then you'd gently tip the paper to shake off the surplus sand or pounce into a special container or back into its shaker, which often looked a bit like a salt or pepper shaker. It's like the ancient, slightly gritty version of desk glitter, but with a much more practical purpose. Blotting paper, as we know it, was also coming into use but wasn't as ubiquitous as sand or pounce in the earlier part of this period. So, you see, the simple act of writing a letter was a mini-production. You needed your collection of quills, your penknife, your ink pot hopefully not dried out, the Regency equivalent of a low battery warning, your precious paper, and your pounce pot or sand shaker. Your fingers might well be ink-stained, a common mark of a diligent correspondent. It was a tactile, personal process, far removed from the ephemeral glow of a screen. Each of these humble tools played its part in crafting those messages that could bring joy, sorrow, news of the world, or whispers of the heart across the miles. It was a slow craft, demanding care and attention, and those very qualities were often reflected in the letters themselves. You're now comfortably ensconced in that Regency atmosphere, your imaginary writing desk arrayed with the quills, ink, and paper we discussed in our last section. You can almost smell the slightly metallic tang of the iron gall ink and feel the smooth, creamy texture of good quality wove paper beneath your fingertips. But having the tools was only the beginning. The next crucial element in the gentle art of correspondence was the presentation, the elegance of your script, the correctness of your prose, and the overall aesthetic appeal of your letter. This wasn't just about conveying information, it was about conveying yourself. In Jane Austen's England, your handwriting was widely considered a direct reflection of your character, your education, and even your social standing. A messy, illegible scrawl could mark you as poorly bred or indifferently educated, while a clear, elegant hand was a sign of refinement and diligence. This is a mainstream historical fact accomplished penmanship, often a graceful a flowing script known as copperplate, or the Italian hand for ladies, was a highly valued social grace. Gentlemen, particularly in business or more formal contexts, might employ a slightly more robust but still neat round hand or mercantile hand. Young people, especially girls, spent countless hours practicing their letters, often using copybooks filled with exemplars set by writing masters. Imagine the pressure. Your entire personality potentially being judged on your ability to execute a perfect capital Q with just the right amount of flourish and no pressure at all. Right? You can picture a young lady, perhaps a character straight out of an Austen novel, diligently bent over her paper, her tongue possibly poking out in concentration as she tries to form each letter with precision. The ideal was a consistent slant, uniform letter height, and elegant loops and swashes, all produced with a light but firm touch of that carefully cut quill we talked about. The very tools, the flexible quill nib, the quality of the ink, the surface of the paper, all played a role in the final appearance. A poorly cut quill or watery ink could make achieving that desired elegance a real challenge, leading to blots, splatters, or uneven lines. It's a far cry from choosing your favorite font on a word processor, a luxury I'm rather grateful for as I type this script for you. Late in the evening, here in Hanoi, one click gives me consistency. They had to earn it with every stroke. Clarity was paramount. While a certain degree of fashionable stylization was acceptable, the primary goal was still legibility. After all, so what good was a beautifully written letter if the recipient couldn't actually read it? You'd want your correspondent to be able to easily discern your tender sentiments or your witty observations, not to be left squinting and muttering. Is that an M or three I's run together? This emphasis on clarity extended to proper grammar, spelling, and punctuation. While spelling was somewhat more variable than it is today, Samuel Johnson's influential dictionary was published in 1755, but standardization took time. Egregious errors would still have been frowned upon. Punctuation, too, was important for conveying meaning and cadence, though its use could sometimes be more rhetorical or breath-based than the strict grammatical rules we often follow now. Now, for a quirky tidbit related to penmanship, the art of the flourish, beyond just forming the letters correctly. Some writers, especially when signing their names or at the end of particularly important lines, would indulge in elaborate decorative swirls and strokes. These flourishes could be quite personal and artistic, a way of adding a little extra panache to the page. Sometimes, these embellishments were so complex they almost obscured the letters they were meant to adorn, becoming a sort of abstract signature in themselves. One can imagine a dandyish young gentleman practicing his signature flourish with as much dedication as he practiced his bow. His sentiments were no doubt profound. One might dryly observe of an overly flourished letter. If only one could decipher whether that magnificent squiggle was intended as a PI or merely a particularly artistic sneeze. Scholars of material culture and education continue to discuss the extent to which standardized handwriting models, like those found in copybooks, were strictly adhered to versus the allowance for individual expression and variation, especially in more informal correspondence between close friends or family. While the ideal was elegance and clarity, individual hands still varied, just as they do today. Some people naturally had a lighter touch, others a heavier one. Some preferred more ornamentation, others a plainer style. These subtle variations could make a letter instantly recognizable as being from a particular person, even before the signature was read. The overall layout of the letter on the page also mattered. Margins were generally observed, though perhaps not as rigidly standardized as in modern formal documents. The date and place of writing were usually at the top. The salutation, "My dearest Fanny," "Dear Sir," would be followed by the body of the letter, and then the closing, "Your affectionate cousin." "I am, sir, your most humble and obedient servant," and signature. Careful planning was needed to ensure the text fit neatly on the page, or pages, without appearing too cramped or too sparse. Remember, paper was precious, and you wanted to make good use of it. So, the act of writing wasn't just about what you said, but very much about how it looked. It was a performance on paper, a visual representation of the sender's care, education, and social grace. They worried about a misplaced comma or an inelegant downstroke. We, in our modern age, might worry if using K as a reply is too abrupt, or if our chosen emoji perfectly conveys our ironic detachment. Different eras, perhaps, but similar underlying anxieties about being understood and presenting ourselves well through the written word. The elegant scripts and proper prose of Jane Austen's England were a testament to a time when communication was a more deliberate, and often more beautiful, art form. You've now mastered the physical art of writing, at least in your imagination. Your quill is perfectly cut, your ink flows smoothly, and your handwriting, as we discussed in the last section, is a model of clarity and elegance. But what do you actually write the content of your letter? The topics you broach, the tone you adopt. These were all governed by a complex web of social etiquette in Jane Austen's England. Crafting your message was an art form in itself, requiring careful consideration of your recipient, your relationship to them, and the delicate dance of societal expectations. Before you'd even dip your quill for the first word, you'd be thinking about your audience. A letter to your intimate sister Cassandra would be vastly different from one addressed to a formidable aunt, a new acquaintance, a respected clergyman, or, heaven forbid, a young gentleman whose attentions were intriguing. The level of formality, the topics considered appropriate, even the amount of personal feeling you could express, all shifted dramatically. To a close family member, you might share daily trifles, candid opinions, or heartfelt anxieties. To a mere acquaintance, your letter would likely be more reserved, focusing on polite inquiries, general news, or formal invitations. It's a bit like adjusting your communication style today. You wouldn't use the same slang and emojis with your boss that you use with your best friend. Would you? At least, I hope not. The Regency equivalent was just a tad more codified. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this is the popularity of letter-writing manuals during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Titles like The Complete Letter Writer or The Young Man's Best Companion were widely available, offering templates, model phrases, and stern advice on the proper tone and content for every conceivable situation, from applying for a position to offering condolences to, yes, even delicately broaching matters of the heart. These guides highlight just how much pressure there was to get it right. They were the Strunk and White of their day, but with added instructions on how not to offend your great Aunt Mildred. So, what were considered suitable topics? News was always welcome. News of family, friends, local happenings, and even broader events, though the latter was often filtered through a personal lens. Health was a constant preoccupation. Inquiries after the recipient's health and reports on one's own were standard. Social engagements, invitations, acceptances, regrets, reports of balls and assemblies formed a huge chunk of correspondence. Think of Mrs. Bennet's obsession with Bingley's ball at Netherfield. The letters flying about before and after such an event would have been numerous. Some letters were practically novellas, detailing every conversation, every gown, every glance exchanged. You'd need a week to read it and another to fully absorb all the subtle social maneuvering described. Gossip, of course, was a delicious, if potentially dangerous, ingredient. One had to be careful. Direct slander or overly harsh criticism, especially if it might be seen by the wrong eyes letters could be shared, after all, was risky. But subtle hints, carefully phrased observations, or the relaying of on dits rumors or it is saids were common. A skilled letter writer could convey a wealth of meaning between the lines. Indeed. This brings us to a quirky tidbit, the art of reading between the lines. Given the social constraints on expressing strong emotions or direct criticism, especially for women, writers often had to imply what they couldn't state openly. An overly effusive description of someone's rather plain new bonnet, for instance, might be a subtle dig. A conspicuous silence on a particular topic could speak volumes. Correspondence became adept at deciphering these unspoken messages, these delicate undercurrents beneath the surface of polite prose. One misplaced adjective about Mrs. P's new pelisse, if reported with just a hint too much amusement, could ignite a social firestorm that would provide conversation fodder for weeks. When it came to expressing emotions, particularly romantic ones, extreme caution was advised, especially for young ladies. A letter that was too forward, too openly affectionate to a gentleman before a formal understanding was in place, could be seen as highly improper. Instead, feelings were often hinted at, veiled in polite phrases, or expressed through the discussion of shared interests or sentimental literature. It was a delicate ballet of words, where a seemingly innocent inquiry about a favorite poem could carry a much deeper romantic resonance. Her letter might be a masterpiece of polite inquiry, but what it was really saying, if he was clever enough to decode it, was, "Notice me, you charming nincompoop." The degree to which individuals felt constrained by prescribed epistolary conventions versus their ability to express genuine emotion or even subversive thoughts within their letters is a nuanced area that literary scholars and social historians continue to explore. While the manuals provided a framework, individual personalities undoubtedly shone through. Jane Austen's own surviving letters, for example, while adhering to the conventions of her time, are also filled with her characteristic wit, sharp observations, and deep affection, particularly in her correspondence with her sister Cassandra. They show that even within the rules, there was room for individuality and genuine connection. The closing of a letter also required care. The choice of phrase, "Your affectionate friend," "Yours sincerely," "Your most obedient servant," depended entirely on the relationship between sender and recipient. A mismatched closing could cause offense or, at the very least, raise an eyebrow. You wouldn't sign off a letter to the formidable Lady Catherine de Bourgh with a breezy "cheers" unless you particularly enjoyed social oblivion. So, you sit at your desk, choosing your words with the precision of a poet and the strategic thinking of a diplomat. Every phrase is weighed, every sentiment considered for its potential impact. It's a far cry from dashing off a quick email, isn't it? This careful crafting, this attention to nuance and propriety, was what made the letters of Jane Austen's England not just communications, but often miniature works of social art. And if you're composing this late at night, as I am now, you'd be doubly careful, because a tired mind can make a slip of the quill that might take days to undo by return of post. The gentle art of correspondence was indeed gentle, but it was also a highly skilled and thoughtfully practiced craft. You've now navigated the delicate etiquette of crafting your message, choosing your words with care, as we discussed in the last section, ensuring your tone and topics were perfectly suited to your recipient in Jane Austen's England. You've filled your sheet of precious paper with news, inquiries, and perhaps some carefully veiled sentiments. But what if you still have more to say? What if the urge to share just one more anecdote, one more observation, is simply irresistible? And what if paper is dear, or postage costs are a concern? Well, my friend, you'd then encounter one of the most curious, eye-straining, and utterly characteristic practices of the era of the crossed letter. Imagine you've written your letter, filling the page from top to bottom with your elegant, flowing script. You reach the end of the sheet, but your thoughts are still bubbling. Instead of taking a fresh and potentially costly second sheet of paper, you simply turn the page you've just written on by 90 degrees, and then you begin to write again, your new lines of script marching bravely across the existing ones, creating a dense, intricate web of words. This, in essence, is a crossed letter, sometimes also called cross-hatching. It was a common and often necessary but space-saving technique, a mainstream historical fact of 18th and 19th century correspondence, born out of a desire to cram as much information as possible onto a single sheet. Think of it as an early analog form of data compression, but for your eyeballs. Why would anyone subject themselves and their correspondence to such a visually challenging format? The primary reasons were economic. As we touched upon when discussing writing materials in Section 2 paper wasn't always cheap, especially finer quality paper. More importantly, postal charges, which we'll delve into more deeply later, were often calculated per sheet of paper, not just by weight. So, using a second sheet could literally double the cost of sending your letter. For those on a budget, or for those writing lengthy epistles to distant loved ones where postage was already a significant expense, crossing their letters was a practical way to get the most value for their money. Every square inch of that paper was made to count. Now, picture yourself receiving such a letter. You unfold it, and instead of clear lines of text on a blank background, you're confronted with a veritable cat's cradle of ink. Your eyes would immediately begin the challenging task of visually separating the horizontal lines from the vertical ones, trying to follow one train of thought without getting derailed by the words running perpendicular to it. It required concentration. Good lighting, perhaps not unlike the focused lamplight you might be using as you listen to this late in the evening. Around 10:30 p.m. here in Hanoi, and a good deal of patience, attempting to decipher a densely crossed letter after a long day, or perhaps after a particularly generous helping of sherry at dinner, was a true test of one's constitution and often led to some fascinating, if entirely unintended, misinterpretations of the news. Did Cousin Agatha say she'd acquired a new cat or a blue hat? The intersecting lines could make all the difference. Despite the difficulty, many correspondents became quite adept at both writing and reading crossed letters. Some writers developed a remarkable neatness in their cross-hatching, ensuring their lines were straight and their letters well-formed, even when writing over previous text. This brings us to a quirky tidbit. While most crossed letters use the same ink for both directions, making them particularly challenging, some more affluent or artistic individuals might occasionally use a different colored ink for the second pass of writing. Imagine a letter written first in black, then crossed in a faded blue or a light brown. This would have made the text slightly easier to distinguish, though it also meant having multiple inks at the ready and added to the expense. Others might vary the angle of the cross-writing slightly, not a perfect 90 degrees, to help the eye pick out the distinct lines. These were little tricks to mitigate the inherent illegibility. Social historians and literary analysts sometimes debate whether the very act of crossing a letter, with its inherent demand for careful, painstaking reading, subtly influenced the intimacy or perceived importance of the correspondence exchanged in this manner. Did the effort required to read it make the content seem more valuable, or was it simply a sign of a thrifty or particularly garrulous correspondent? Perhaps a bit of both. Certainly, if someone went to the trouble of writing you a four-sided, densely crossed letter, you knew they had a lot to share and probably expected you to invest the time to unravel it all. It was a commitment on both the writer's and the reader's part. You can find numerous examples of crossed letters in the surviving correspondence of Jane Austen and her contemporaries. Her own letters to her sister Cassandra often feature this technique, packed with family news, witty observations about society, and details of her daily life. It's a testament to how commonplace the practice was, even among those who were highly literate and valued clear communication. They simply had more to say than a single, uncrossed sheet would allow, or they were being mindful of the costs involved in their frequent exchanges. Some historians now believe, yet with a twinkle in their eye, that the subsequent boom in the development of spectacles and headache remedies in the 19th century directly correlated with the peak popularity of the crossed letter. Probably not true, but it makes for a good story. Reading a crossed letter today, even a high-quality digital scan of one, still requires a special kind of focus. You find yourself tilting your head, zooming in, trying to isolate one layer of meaning from the other. It gives you a real appreciation for the dedication of Regency-era readers. They weren't just passively consuming text, they were actively decoding it, wrestling with its physical form. It makes the quick skim of an email or a text message seem almost laughably effortless by comparison. So, the next time you're tempted to complain about a slightly blurry font or an oddly formatted web page, spare a thought for the recipients of crossed letters. They were the true champions of textual endurance. Their reward, the precious news and sentiments woven into those intricate, ink-laden pages. It was a curious practice, born of necessity and a love for communication, a testament to the human desire to connect, even if it meant making your reader go a little bit cross-eyed in the process. Section 6. You've now painstakingly penned your letter, perhaps even resorting to that eye-crossing technique we just explored to fit all your news onto a single sheet. Your words are committed, your thoughts expressed, but your task isn't quite finished. Before your missive can begin its journey, it needs to be secured, protected from prying eyes, and authenticated as genuinely yours. This is where the ancient and rather satisfying ritual of folding and sealing comes into play, involving melted wax and personal emblems, a far cry from licking a modern self-adhesive envelope. In Jane Austen's England, pre-made envelopes as we know them were not in common use for everyday correspondence. Instead, a mainstream historical fact is that the letter sheet itself was ingeniously folded to become its own enclosure. There were various methods for this, some quite intricate, but the general idea was to fold the paper in such a way that the blank outer surfaces formed the envelope, leaving a panel for the address on one side and a flap on the other that could be secured. It was a neat bit of paper engineering, ensuring that the contents remained private until intentionally opened. Once your letter was folded into a compact packet, the crucial step was sealing it. This was done with sealing wax, which came in sticks, looking a bit like stubby, colored candles. You would light the end of the stick, or hold it over a flame, perhaps the same candle that illuminated your writing, its flame dancing gently in the quiet of your room, much like the soft light you might have now as you're listening to this late in the evening here in Hanoi. You'd allow the melting wax to drip onto the point where the final flap of the folded letter met the main body. Then, before the wax hardened, you would press your seal firmly into it. This seal wasn't just any old stamp. It was a personal device, usually a signet ring worn on the finger or a desk seal with a handle, made of metal, stone like agate or carnelian, or even glass. The engraved design could be a family crest or coat of arms, the owner's initials or monogram, a classical motif like a Greek god or a philosophical emblem, a sentimental image, or even a punning device called a rebus, not to be confused with the rebus principle in writing, though related in its love of visual wordplay. Pressing this into the warm wax left a distinct, raised impression. This did two things firstly. It physically secured the letter. If the seal was broken, the recipient would know the letter had been tampered with. Secondly, it authenticated the sender, as your seal was uniquely yours like a fingerprint in wax. A smudged or poorly made seal was undesirable. It could suggest haste, carelessness, or even, in a very suspicious mind, an attempt to obscure a less than genuine origin. A smudged seal, one might muse, could mean anything from "I was in a great hurry and nearly set the drapes on fire" to "a small, particularly curious badger attacked my writing desk mid-sealing." Always ambiguous. The quality and color of the sealing wax itself could also convey subtle messages, which brings us to our quirky tidbit for this section. Red was the most common color for general correspondence and business letters, a robust, no-nonsense choice. Black wax, predictably, was used for mourning letters, its somber hue instantly signaling the sad nature of the contents even before the seal was broken. But other colors existed: greens, blues, yellows, even white. While not as common for everyday post, these might have been used for more decorative purposes, or perhaps, in some circles, as private signals between correspondents. Imagine a secret understanding where a letter sealed with blue wax meant good news, while green signaled caution. It adds another layer of potential meaning to these already information-rich objects. The extent to which the specific design of a seal, whether that classical muse, a sentimental cupid, or a simple, bold initial, was consciously chosen to convey a particular nuance or message beyond mere identification is something heraldry experts and social historians occasionally ponder. Should I use the family crest to impress? A gentleman might wonder. My initials for a touch of modern simplicity, or this rather fetching intaglio of a stoic-looking pug to show my whimsical side decisions. Decisions that truly defined your personal brand. There's a certain undeniable gravitas, a satisfying finality, to pressing a seal into warm wax. You can almost feel that slight resistance. See the wax ooze around the edges of the die? And then the crisp, clear impression emerging as you lift the seal. It's a deliberate act, a tangible punctuation mark at the end of your communicative effort. And for the recipient, breaking that seal was equally significant. You couldn't just casually rip it open like a modern envelope. It often required a letter opener, or careful fingers, to crack the wax without tearing the precious paper beneath. It was a small ritual, a moment of anticipation before the words within were finally revealed. It's akin to the satisfying feeling some get from an unboxing video today, that little thrill of breaking the pristine seal to get to the contents. The security offered by a wax seal was, of course, not foolproof. A determined spy or a particularly nosy individual could, with care, attempt to soften the wax with heat, lift the seal, read the contents, and reseal it. But it was a deterrent, and a fairly effective one for most everyday purposes. It made casual snooping difficult and left telltale signs if tampering occurred. In a world without digital encryption or password-protected emails, this physical barrier was the primary means of ensuring your private thoughts remained private on their journey through the postal system. So, your letter, once a blank sheet, then filled with your elegant script, perhaps even crossed as we discussed, is now a neatly folded packet, bearing your unique mark in hardened wax. It's ready for the next stage of its adventure, the journey to its recipient. The act of sealing it transforms it from a personal document into a missive prepared for the public, or at least semi-public realm of the post. It's a little parcel of thoughts, news, and emotions, all bundled up and stamped with your identity, ready to brave the roads and the sorting offices of Regency England. Your carefully penned and sealed letter, that little packet of thoughts and news we prepared in the last section, is now ready to leave your hands. But how does it actually get from your writing desk in, say, as a quiet Hampshire village to your cousin in bustling Bath, or your brother stationed with his regiment in a far-flung corner of the kingdom? You'd entrust it to the surprisingly complex and ever-evolving machinery of the Royal Mail, a system that, for its time, was a marvel of organization and, occasionally, a source of immense frustration. Forget popping it in a bright red pillar box on the corner. In Jane Austen's era, you'd likely take your letter to the local post office, which might be a dedicated building in a larger town, or perhaps just a room in an inn or a shop in a smaller village, run by a postmaster or postmistress. Here, your letter would begin its journey. The cost of sending a letter was a significant consideration. Unlike our modern system where the sender usually pays a flat rate with a stamp, postage in the Regency period was typically paid by the recipient upon delivery, and the rates were not simple. They were calculated based on the distance the letter had to travel and, crucially, the number of sheets of paper. A single sheet letter over a certain distance cost a certain amount. A double sheet letter cost double, and so on. This is why, as we've discussed, people were so keen on practices like crossed letter section 5 to cram as much as possible onto that single precious sheet to keep costs down for their correspondent. Imagine the slightly awkward moment of receiving a wonderfully thick, newsy letter from your most verbose aunt, only to be presented with a rather hefty bill by the postman. Oh, joy, another 3-page epic on the price of ribbons. That'll be tuppence one then. The real revolution in mail delivery, and a mainstream historical fact you should know, was the introduction of the mail coach system by John Palmer in 1784. Before Palmer, mail was often carried by slow, unreliable postboys on horseback, vulnerable to weather, bad roads, and, of course, highwaymen. Palmer's idea was to use fast, specially designed coaches, traveling to strict timetables, carrying passengers as well as mail, and, importantly, accompanied by armed guards. These mail coaches, typically painted in the smart black and maroon or sometimes red livery of the post office, became an iconic sight on British roads. You can almost hear the blast of the guard's post horn announcing their imminent arrival in a village, the thunder of hooves, and the rumble of wheels as the coach swept through, a tangible link to the wider world. They were the high-speed internet of their day, promising relatively swift delivery, lightning fast, by Regency standards, meaning your letter might get from London to Bath in well under 24 hours, provided the roads weren't quagmires of mud, a wheel didn't break, and they didn't get stuck behind a particularly slow flock of sheep. These coaches operated on a network of routes, with major arteries connecting London to other large towns, and interconnecting services fanning out from there. At coaching inns along the way, horses would be changed with remarkable speed, ensuring minimal delay. The mailbags, securely locked, would be sorted at various stages. Larger towns had general post offices, bustling hubs of activity, especially at night, which is when many of the mail coaches would depart or arrive to ensure letters posted one day could begin their journey without losing precious hours. While I'm here in Hanoi, on this particular Monday evening, May 19th, 2025, able to send information around the globe in an instant, it's quite something to picture those mail coaches relentlessly thundering through the dark English countryside, carrying their precious cargo of handwritten words. Now for a quirky, or perhaps rather thrilling, tidbit. Despite the armed guards who were typically equipped with a blunderbuss and a pair of pistols, mail coach robberies did still occur. The image of the dashing highwaymen calling "stand and deliver" wasn't entirely a romantic fiction, though the reality was probably far less glamorous and much more terrifying. Losing the mail was a serious affair, not just for the individuals awaiting their letters, but for commerce and government business. The guards were there not just to protect the mail, but also the passengers, and probably to ensure the coachman adhered to the punishing schedule and didn't decide to accidentally lose a particularly heavy mailbag when faced with a steep hill. The efficiency and reach of the postal service, however, is something economic historians continue to map and analyze. While the mail coach network dramatically improved services between major centers, the last-mile delivery to very remote rural parishes or isolated country houses could still be slow and less predictable. Local carriers, sometimes on foot or by cart, would distribute letters from the nearest post town. And, of course, not every area was equally well served. If you lived in a tiny, out-of-the-way hamlet, you might only get mail delivered once or twice a week. Or you might have to make arrangements to collect it yourself from the nearest post office, which could be several miles away. The arrival of the post was a significant event in the daily routine, especially in quieter country households. The anticipation we spoke of in Section 1 was very real. Would there be a letter from London News from a son away at school? A reply from a potential suitor the whole household might gather, awaiting the distribution of the day's correspondence. And if a letter was expected but didn't arrive, the disappointment could be keen. There were no tracking numbers. No, your parcel is out for delivery notifications. There was just the hope and the waiting. So the Royal Mail of Jane Austen's England, with its iconic coaches, its complex tariffs, and its dedicated, if sometimes beleaguered, staff, was the vital circulatory system for the nation's personal and professional correspondence. It was a system under constant pressure to improve, to expand, and to become more affordable. Changes that would slowly but surely come throughout the 19th century. But for our Regency correspondents, it was the lifeline they depended on, the conduit through which their carefully crafted words, their joys, sorrows, and everyday news made their often lengthy and perilous journey. You've now seen your letter safely entrusted to the Royal Mail, perhaps picturing it rumbling along in one of those iconic mail coaches we discussed in the last section, on its way to a recipient who would likely have to pay for the privilege of reading your news. That is, unless your letter happened to be traveling under a rather special dispensation, a perk enjoyed by the well-connected and the powerful, the franking privilege. This was the golden ticket of the Regency postal world, a way to send your letters entirely free of charge, a sort of diplomatic pouch for the elite. So, what exactly was this franking, and who got to enjoy this delightful free pass? This is a mainstream historical fact. The franking privilege was a right granted to members of Parliament, both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, as well as certain high-ranking government officials and public offices, to frank a letter. The privileged individual simply had to sign their name on the front cover of the folded letter, usually in a specific corner, often along with the date and place of signing. This signature acted as a signal to the post office that no postage was to be collected from the recipient. Voila, free delivery. You can imagine the slight swagger of an MP as they dashed off their signature. Knowing their words would travel unburdened by mundane postal fees, never mind his political acumen or his stirring speeches in Parliament, for many of his acquaintances, an MP's real power lay in his ability to get their Aunt Agatha's 10-page, densely crossed treatise on the failings of the local vicar delivered across the country without costing her a penny. The original intention behind the franking privilege was, ostensibly, to facilitate official government business and communication between MPs and their constituents. In an era before dedicated budgets for parliamentary office expenses, it was seen as a necessary means for legislators to carry out their duties without personal financial burden. However, as you might already be suspecting, this high-minded principle was, shall we say, stretched to its absolute limits, and then some. The privilege was widely, almost universally, used for personal correspondence. MPs would frank letters for their families, their friends, their friends' friends, their distant cousins twice removed. Basically, anyone who could politely or not so politely request the favor. This brings us to our quirky, and frankly rather amusing, tidbit: the sheer scale of the trading and begging of franks. If you knew an MP, or knew someone who knew an MP, you'd do your utmost to get your letters included in their daily batch of franked mail. Some MPs, particularly those with large social circles or those eager to curry favor, were known to spend a considerable portion of their day simply signing their names on stacks of letters for others. It became a form of social currency, a way of bestowing a small but tangible benefit. Diaries and letters from the period are full of references to seeking a frank from Mr. So-and-so, or enclosing this undercover to Lord such-and-such, meaning they'd send their letter to the peer, who would then frank it and send it on. The mail coaches we talked about weren't just groaning under the weight of vital state secrets and urgent commercial dispatches. They were also heavily laden with invitations to tea, gossip about the latest elopement, and lengthy descriptions of new bonnets, all traveling scot-free thanks to a friendly parliamentarian's signature. Quick, is Sir Reginald in town? You might imagine someone exclaiming, I have this absolutely vital missive regarding the upcoming assembly ball and the scandalous price of silk ribbons, and I simply cannot be expected to pay tuppence for its delivery. The rules around franking did try to impose some limits, though they were often circumvented. For instance, there were restrictions on the weight of a franked letter and the number of letters an MP could send or receive franked per day when Parliament was not in session. The letter was also supposed to be addressed to a specific place and posted on the day it was dated and signed. But human ingenuity, especially when faced with the prospect of saving money, is a powerful force. Forgeries of franks were not unknown, and various ruses were employed to get around the restrictions. The economic impact of the franking privilege on post office revenues and the extent to which its widespread abuses hastened calls for comprehensive postal reform, which eventually led to the penny post in 1840, are subjects that postal historians continue to analyze and debate. It was a massive drain on the post office's income, as a huge proportion of the mail, particularly the mail generated by the wealthier and more influential sections of society, traveled for free. It also created a rather two-tiered system. Those with access to francs could correspond voluminously without a second thought to cost, while ordinary folk had to carefully consider the expense of every sheet of paper they sent. Imagine if such a system existed today. Say in 2025, where certain influential individuals here in Vietnam or anywhere else could bypass all internet or data charges for themselves and their friends. The outcry on social media would be deafening, and quite rightly so. For Jane Austen's characters, access to a franc could be a minor plot point or a reflection of social connection. A character who can easily send and receive letters franked is clearly well connected. Someone who has to carefully count their pennies for postage might write less frequently, or resort to those densely crossed pages we've explored. It's one of those subtle background details that added texture to the social landscape she depicted. The sight of a franked letter, with that bold signature scrawled across its front, would have immediately signaled its privileged status. It was a visible marker of connection to the echelons of power. No grubby postal markings indicating charges due. Just the confident flourish of a name that opened the postal gates. It was, in its own small way, a daily reminder of the prevailing social hierarchies and the not insignificant perks that came with being on the right side of them. So, while most letters embarked on their journey with a price tag attached, a significant stream flowed freely, carried on the back of a signature and the ancient right of parliamentary privilege. You've seen how the franking privilege we discussed in the last section could grant certain letters a free pass through the postal system, a coveted perk in Jane Austen's England, but whether your anticipated letter arrived franked or requiring payment. The moment of its actual arrival was often charged with a unique blend of excitement, anxiety, and profound relief, after days, perhaps even weeks, of waiting for news. The sound that heralded the post was a very welcome one indeed. Imagine yourself in a quiet country drawing room, or perhaps a bustling London townhouse. Life unfolds at its own pace, but there's an undercurrent of expectation. You're awaiting word from a loved one, a reply to an important query, or simply the latest news from afar. Then you hear it, the distant blast of a post horn from the mail coach as it nears the village, or the sharp rap of the local postman at the door. Instantly, the household might stir. This wasn't like the constant, almost ignored stream of notifications pinging on our smartphones here in 2025, each one vying for a sliver of our attention. No, the arrival of the post in Regency England was a distinct event, a focal point in the day or week. Was it the charming local postman himself? Perhaps with a twinkle in his eye, or the tantalizing possibility of a letter from London that made hearts flutter more. A mystery for the ages. I suspect. A mainstream historical fact is that the arrival of the mail was a significant and eagerly anticipated occurrence in many households. Depending on the efficiency of the local service and your location, this might be a daily event, or it might happen only a few times a week. In larger homes, a servant might be dispatched to collect the mail from the post office or meet the mail coach. Upon its arrival at the house, the bag of letters, if there was more than one, would be brought in, often with a certain ceremony. Perhaps the master or mistress of the house would sort through them, calling out the names of the recipients. You can picture the scene faces lighting up as their name is called, a slight frown of disappointment if there's nothing for them that day. A letter delayed by even a day or two, especially if eagerly awaited, could cause a Regency tragedy of epic proportions, sparking fears of illness, accidents, highwaymen having intercepted the coach, or perhaps even worse in some circumstances, a sudden and inexplicable cooling of affections from one's correspondent. Once a letter was in your hands, that precious sealed packet we talked about in Section 6, the next ritual was breaking it open. You'd carefully crack that wax seal, trying not to tear the paper too much. Your anticipation mounting. What news lay within whose familiar handwriting would greet you? This brings us to a rather charming, if perhaps slightly unhygienic by modern standards, quirky tidbit. Some individuals, particularly when receiving a letter from a cherished sweetheart, or a very dear friend, might have had the habit of briefly smelling the letter before fully unfolding it. They'd be hoping, perhaps, to catch the faintest lingering trace of their correspondent's favorite perfume, the scent of the tobacco they smoked, or even just the unique aroma of their particular writing desk and ink. It was a tiny, intimate connection before the words themselves were even seen. Then came the reading. If the letter was of a general nature, containing news of family or friends, it might be read aloud in the family circle, perhaps after dinner, with everyone gathered around to hear the latest tidings. This public consumption of letters is an interesting aspect of Regency life. The extent to which the public reading of letters within the family circle influenced the content and tone of correspondence, potentially self-censoring more intimate expressions or encouraging a certain performative style, is a point of discussion among social historians. One had to be mindful that one's words might be shared beyond the intended recipient. However, more personal letters, those from a particular friend, a confidant, or especially a romantic interest, would almost certainly be whisked away to be read in private. Imagine retreating to your own room, or a quiet corner of the garden, to savor every word, to absorb every nuance of phrasing, the seal broken, the contents eagerly scanned, only to realize, with a slight sigh, that it's from your verbose Aunt Mildred again, and her handwriting still looks like a spider fell into an inkwell and then had a rather prolonged and messy seizure on the page. Ah, the joys of correspondence. But if it was a longed-for letter, the emotions could be intense joy at good news, relief that a loved one was well, a blush at a tender endearment, or perhaps a pang of sorrow if the tidings were unhappy. And letters weren't just read once. Oh no, a particularly cherished letter would be reread multiple times, its phrases committed to memory, its sentiments mulled over. It might be tucked under a pillow, carried in a pocket, or stored safely in a writing desk or a special letterbox. It became a tangible piece of the absent person, a connection that could be revisited time and again. You'd analyze every sentence and every choice of word. Did his use of affectionately mean more than sincerely? Was her mention of a shared memory, a hint of deeper feeling? It was a close reading that would put most literary critics to shame. The sharing of letters was also common. Though selective, a young lady might share a particularly amusing letter from a cousin with her sister, or read out extracts from a friend's travelogue. But highly personal or scandalous content would be shared only with the most trusted confidants, often accompanied by whispered injunctions to secrecy. You must not breathe a word of this to another soul, but listen to what Charlotte says about Mr. W. So, the journey of a letter didn't end when it was delivered. It continued in the reading, the rereading, the sharing, and the emotional impact it had on its recipient. It was a far more immersive and often more emotionally charged experience than glancing at a text message while waiting for the kettle to boil. Each letter was a little piece of someone else's life, arriving to interrupt, illuminate, or perhaps complicate your own. And the anticipation of its arrival was a thread of excitement woven through the fabric of daily life in Jane Austen's England. You've now experienced that delicious shiver of anticipation, that flutter in your chest as the post arrives, bringing longed-for news or perhaps an unexpected missive. As we explored in our last section, the emotional impact of a letter in Jane Austen's England was undeniable. And who better to understand and utilize this power than Jane Austen herself? It's a mainstream historical fact that Austen frequently and masterfully employed letters as crucial narrative devices in her novels. They are far more than just incidental communications. They are engines of the plot, windows into character, and vehicles for some of the most pivotal moments in her stories. As you immerse yourself in one of her novels, you'll notice how often the arrival of a letter, or indeed its contents, can dramatically shift the direction of the narrative. Think of Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Darcy's famous letter to Elizabeth Bennet, handed to her after his disastrous first proposal, is a cornerstone of the entire novel. It's a lengthy, detailed, and deeply personal document in which he lays bare the truth about Mr. Wickham and explains his own actions regarding Jane and Bingley. As Elizabeth reads this letter, and you, the reader, are essentially reading it over her shoulder, her entire perception of Darcy and of Wickham begins to crumble and reform. It's a moment of profound revelation, delivered entirely through the written word. You can almost feel Elizabeth's shock, her mortification, her dawning understanding, all emanating from those densely filled pages. Darcy's letter was so long and detailed. Elizabeth probably needed several quiet walks around the park, a nap, and a very strong cup of tea just to process the sheer volume of information and emotional upheaval. Talk about an information dump that changes everything. Then there's Captain Wentworth's iconic letter to Anne Elliot in Persuasion. Oh, that letter scribbled hastily on a blotter in a crowded bath inn, while he's supposedly writing something else entirely. It's a passionate, heartfelt declaration of his undying love. You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. For readers who have been yearning for Anne and Wentworth to find their way back to each other, this letter is the emotional climax. Its arrival, its secret reading by Anne, the overwhelming flood of her emotions. It's a masterclass in using correspondence to deliver a powerful romantic punch. Captain Wentworth proving that, sometimes, the most impactful and romantic declarations are not delivered in grand speeches, but are scribbled hastily in a crowded room while pretending to be engrossed in other business. Very smooth. Captain, very smooth indeed. Austen uses letters in myriad ways. Sometimes they provide essential exposition, conveying information about offstage events or characters that the reader and other characters need to know. Think of Lydia Bennet's ill-judged, giddy letter from Brighton in Pride and Prejudice, revealing her elopement with Wickham, which throws the entire Bennet family into chaos. Or the often humorous, gossipy, or self-important letters from characters like Mrs. Jennings in Sense and Sensibility or Miss Bates in Emma, which, while seemingly trivial, can reveal much about social circles, prevailing attitudes, or even drop subtle clues about developing plot lines. One minute you're reading a character's charming description of a country walk or a new bonnet, and the next, bam. A secret engagement is revealed, a scandalous rumor is confirmed, or a devastating character assassination is subtly delivered. Austen's literary letters are definitely not for the emotionally faint of heart. A quirky tidbit about Austen's use of letters is how the absence or delay of an expected letter can be just as potent a plot device as the letters themselves. Characters anxiously await the post, their hopes rising and falling with each delivery or lack thereof. This creates suspense and highlights the emotional dependence on written communication. Think of Jane Bennet waiting for news from Bingley in London, her spirit sinking as no letter arrives. The silence speaks volumes about his apparent indifference or, as we later learn, the interference of others. Literary critics continue to analyze the subtle ways Austen manipulates narrative voice and perspective through her use of letters. When a character writes a letter within the novel, are we getting their unvarnished truth, their innermost thoughts? Or is the letter itself another performance? A carefully constructed persona designed to elicit a particular response from its recipient. Often, it's a complex mix. A letter allows Austen to give a character their own voice directly, unfiltered by the third-person narrator, offering insights we might not otherwise get. But we also learn to read these letters critically, just as the characters themselves do, judging the writer by their style, their tone, and what they choose to include or omit, much like the social judgments based on handwriting we discussed in Section 3. The epistolary novel, a novel written primarily or entirely in the form of letters, was a popular genre in the 18th century, and Austen was certainly familiar with it. While her own novels are not strictly epistolary, she clearly draws on this tradition. Recognizing the unique dramatic and psychological potential of incorporating letters directly into her narrative, it allows for multiple perspectives, for dramatic irony when the reader knows more than the characters, or vice versa, based on who has seen which letters, and for a sense of immediacy and intimacy. It's a technique that still resonates, even today. As I sit here in Hanoi in 2025 thinking about how modern storytellers use text messages or emails on screen to drive plots, It's clear that Austen was a pioneer in using the dominant communication technology of her era to its full literary potential. So, when you next pick up an Austen novel, pay special attention to those moments when a letter is mentioned. Received, read, or written. It's rarely just a casual detail now. More often than not, that piece of paper is about to unlock a secret, change a heart, or send the plot careening off in an entirely new and engrossing direction. All thanks to the gentle, yet incredibly powerful art of correspondence. You've seen how Jane Austen masterfully wielded letters as potent plot devices in her novels, as we explored in our last section, turning simple correspondence into moments of high drama or profound revelation. But beyond these literary highlights, the everyday letter-writing world of Regency England encompassed a vast array of purposes and styles. There truly was a letter for every occasion, each with its own subtle nuances, expected formulas, and social significance. Your writing desk wasn't just for pouring out your heart, it was your command center for navigating the complex social landscape. Think about the sheer variety of communications you manage today, even if mostly digitally. Event invites, thank you messages, quick updates to friends, formal work emails, expressions of sympathy, maybe even the occasional romantic text. Well, your Regency counterpart had a similar range, all channeled through the medium of pen and paper. A mainstream historical fact is that very specific conventions and even prescribed formulas existed for different types of social correspondence. Adhering to these was a clear indicator of your good breeding and social awareness. Those letter-writing manuals we mentioned back in Section 4 would have been filled with examples how to address a baronet. A model letter of congratulation on a marriage. An elegant form of refusal to a dinner invitation. It was like having a social GPS, guiding you through the tricky terrain of politeness. Let's start with the bread and butter of social life invitations. Whether it was an invitation to a grand ball, an intimate dinner party, a morning call, or a country visit. These were almost invariably issued in writing. Formal invitations, especially from a lady of high standing, were often written in the third person. Lady Bertram requests the pleasure of Mr. Rushworth's company at dinner on Tuesday next at 7 o'clock. No friendly, hey, want to come over here? The paper might be of a finer quality, the script particularly neat, and your reply, whether an acceptance or a regret, would mirror this formality. Also, typically in the third person, Mr. Rushworth accepts with pleasure Lady Bertram's kind invitation. It was a precise, almost ritualistic exchange. Was this invitation from Lady C to her evening route a genuine desire for your sparkling company? Or merely a strategic move in the great social chessboard to observe your interactions with her eligible nephew? One never truly knew, but one always replied with impeccable propriety. Then there were thank you notes. After attending a dinner, a ball, or staying as a house guest, a promptly written thank you letter was absolutely de rigueur. To neglect this was a mark of poor manners. These notes didn't have to be long, but they needed to be sincere or at least appear so, expressing appreciation for the hospitality received. The timing was also key, which is a rather quirky tidbit. A thank you note dispatched with alacrity signaled genuine gratitude, one that arrived, say, 3 weeks late for a rather mediocre dinner party and a lukewarm glass of ratafia, spoke volumes about your true feelings without a single impolite word being penned. The passive-aggressive potential was, shall we say, considerable. Letters of congratulation were required for happy events, births, marriages, notable achievements. Conversely, letters of condolence were a solemn duty upon a bereavement. These were perhaps the most difficult to write, demanding a delicate balance of heartfelt sympathy, respectful formality, and shared grief. Trying to strike that perfect tone between, I am so terribly sorry for your loss, and not accidentally reminding you of something even more distressing from page 2, was an art form in itself, often relying on established phrases to navigate the treacherous emotional waters. You might see such letters written on paper with a black border, a visual cue of their somber content even before they were opened. Beyond the purely social, there were business letters. Gentlemen, especially, would conduct a great deal of their affairs. Legal matters, estate management, investments through correspondence. These letters would be more direct, focused on facts and figures, though still couched in polite and formal language. A merchant in London might write to his agent in Bristol, a landowner to his steward, a lawyer to his client, all relying on the written word to convey instructions, reports, and agreements. And then, the lifeblood of more intimate connections, the newsy, gossipy, everyday letters exchanged between family members and close friends. These were the spaces where one could be more relaxed, more candid, though still with an awareness that letters could be read by others. You'd share details of your daily life, observations on mutual acquaintances, anxieties about health or finances, joys and frustrations. These letters, like those Jane Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra, are often the most revealing, offering a vibrant, personal glimpse into the texture of Regency life. They are the equivalent of those long, rambling phone calls or endless text chains we have with our closest confidants, filled with everything and nothing, but utterly essential for maintaining connection. And finally, of course, the love letter. This was a category all its own, fraught with peril and potential. From tentative expressions of admiration to passionate declarations, from clandestine arrangements for a stolen meeting to heartbroken farewells, love letters carried the heaviest emotional charge. Here the conventions might be bent, the language more poetic or more raw, depending on the individuals and the stage of their courtship. Secrecy was often paramount. A discovered love letter could cause a scandal, ruin reputations, or dash hopes. These were the letters clutched to the heart, read and reread until the creases wore thin, the ink perhaps blurred by a tear or two. Historians of domestic life, even today as I speak to you from Hanoi in 2025, continue to explore the subtle emotional labor involved in maintaining such extensive social correspondence, particularly for women, who were often the primary managers of a family's social calendar and connections. This constant round of writing invitations, thank yous, family updates, and polite inquiries was a significant, if often invisible, part of their role, shaping their social networks and influence in quiet but powerful ways. Each type of letter, from the most formal third-person invitation to the most intensely personal confession, played its part in weaving the intricate and fascinating social fabric of Jane Austen's England. You've now surveyed the wide array of letters that crisscrossed Jane Austen's England, from the most formal third-person invitations to the most intimate confessions. As we explored in the last section, each had its place, its protocol. But for individuals in more dependent or precarious positions, such as governesses, poor relations, or young people working away from home for the first time, letters took on an even more profound significance. For them, correspondence wasn't just a social nicety. It was often a vital lifeline, a fragile thread connecting them to their past, their support systems, and their hopes for the future. Imagine yourself as a governess in a grand, but perhaps not entirely welcoming, household. You are educated, refined, yet you occupy an uncomfortable social limbo, not quite a servant, but certainly not a member of the family. Your days are spent in the schoolroom, patiently or perhaps not so patiently, drumming lessons into the heads of your charges. Evenings might be spent alone, or in the awkward periphery of family life. In such an isolated environment, the arrival of a letter from your own dear mother, your sister, or a trusted friend from happier times would be like a ray of sunshine in a drab room. It would be a tangible link to a world where you were known, loved, and understood, a world outside the often stifling confines of your employment. This is a mainstream historical fact. Governesses in the 19th century often led lonely lives, caught in that ambiguous space between the upstairs and downstairs worlds. Letters were their crucial connection to their own families and friends, offering not just emotional solace but also practical support. A letter might bring news from home, advice on how to handle a difficult employer or a rebellious pupil, or even, crucially, leads for a new position should the current one become untenable. The cost of postage, which we discussed in Section 7, would have been a very real concern for a governess on a meager salary. Every penny counted, so each letter sent or received was a considered investment. There was no franking privilege Section 8 for the likes of Miss Taylor or Jane Fairfax before their respective marriages. Her budget for sealing wax and paper was probably tighter than Lady Catherine de Bourgh's famously rigid opinions. So every drop and every sheet was precious. Think of the quiet desperation that might infuse some of these letters. A governess seeking a new post might write dozens of carefully worded applications, her future hinging on the replies. Wanted a governess of good character. An advertisement might read, must be proficient in French, music, drawing, and the use of the globes. Experience with particularly spirited children an advantage. Her responding letter would need to be a masterpiece of self-promotion and deference. The anxiety of waiting for those replies, for a letter that might offer escape or, conversely, another closed door, must have been immense. The content of a governess's letters to her family would likely be a mix. She might recount amusing anecdotes about her pupils, little Timmy's latest escapade perhaps translated from an actual terror who has, for the third time this week, replaced my best quills with half-chewed twigs. To the more diplomatic, Master Timothy continues to exhibit a most energetic and inquisitive nature. She might also express her loneliness, her frustrations, her longing for home, though often couched in careful language. Aware that her letters, if too complaining, might cause worry. It was, in many ways, the only space where she could truly, if subtly, speak her mind or unburden her heart. Now for a quirky and rather poignant tidbit, the use of poste restante, or a blind accommodation address for governesses or others in similarly tenuous positions. If a governess was unhappy and seeking a new situation without her current employer's knowledge, or if she was moving frequently and her exact address was uncertain, she might arrange for letters to be sent to a local post office to be held for her, or to a trusted third party. This offered a degree of privacy and discretion in a life where her own correspondence might otherwise be subject to the casual scrutiny of the household she served. The extent to which letters from individuals in dependent positions were subject to outright censorship or informal oversight by employers or heads of households is difficult to ascertain definitively, but it certainly remains a concern for historians studying these personal and often vulnerable correspondences. Letters were also vital for poor relations, those individuals dependent on the charity or goodwill of wealthier family members. A letter requesting a small loan, assistance in finding a situation, or simply an invitation for a visit which might provide a temporary respite from difficult circumstances had to be phrased with utmost delicacy, balancing genuine need with the requisite humility and gratitude. The power dynamics inherent in such correspondence were palpable. The sender was in a position of supplication. The recipient held the power to grant or refuse. Young men starting out in careers away from home, perhaps a clerk in London, an apprentice in a provincial town, or a junior officer in the Army or Navy, also relied heavily on letters. For them, letters from home brought comfort, news, and perhaps much-needed funds. Their own letters back would be filled with descriptions of their new life, their challenges, their small triumphs. These exchanges maintained family ties and provided a sense of continuity in a rapidly changing world. Even now, as I sit here in Hanoi, Vietnam, a place very far from my own original home, I can appreciate how essential that connection to family and old friends is, though thankfully today we have instant video calls rather than waiting weeks for a ship to carry a letter. The fundamental human need to bridge distance and share our lives, however, remains unchanged. So, while the grand balls and elegant drawing rooms of Austen's gentry often take center stage, it's important to remember these other letter writers, those whose correspondence was perhaps less about social maneuvering and more about survival, solace, and the enduring strength of human connection in the face of isolation or hardship. For the governess in her lonely schoolroom, the poor relation carefully choosing her words, or the young apprentice far from his hearth, The arrival of a letter was more than just news. It was a reminder that they were not forgotten, a whisper of hope or comfort carried on a fragile sheet of paper. Their post, though perhaps less voluminous or less elegantly penned than that of their wealthier contemporaries, was imbued with a profound and often deeply moving significance. You've just considered the poignant and vital role letters played for those in dependent positions, like the governess in her often isolated world, as we discussed in the last section. Their correspondence was a lifeline, heavy with personal hopes and anxieties. Now, let's turn our attention to the other side of the societal coin, or perhaps more accurately, another facet of it, the correspondence penned by a gentleman's hand in Jane Austen's England. While women were often the mistresses of social and familial letter writing, men too wielded the quill for a wide array of purposes, their letters reflecting their distinct roles, responsibilities, and preoccupations in Regency society. Imagine yourself stepping into a gentleman's study or library. It might be a room lined with leather-bound books, perhaps a globe in the corner, a map on the wall, the faint scent of tobacco or old paper in the air. Here, at his solid writing desk, a gentleman would attend to his correspondence. And a mainstream historical fact is that this correspondence would cover a broad spectrum, mirroring his engagement with the public sphere as well as his private life. Business and estate management formed a significant portion for many. Landowners like Mr. Darcy or Mr. Knightley would have been in regular communication with their stewards or agents, discussing crop yields, tenant issues, timber sales, and property improvements. These letters would be practical, detailed, and often direct, perhaps employing that more robust mercantile hand we touched upon in Section 3. Dear Sir, a typical business letter might begin. Regarding the matter of the overdue rents from Farmer Giles, ascertain the cause of delay and report back by Tuesday next. Yours, etc. Not much room for flowery pleasantries when it came to pounds, shillings, and pence. Politics was another major arena for mail correspondence. Members of Parliament who, as we know from Section 8, enjoyed that lovely franking privilege would be writing to constituents, to fellow MPs, to party grandees, discussing policy, debating bills, and strategizing for elections. Letters flew back and forth between London and country estates, carrying news of parliamentary divisions, political intrigues, and the rise and fall of ministries. For gentlemen involved in local governance as magistrates or sheriffs, correspondence would deal with legal matters, public order, and civic duties. For those in the professions, letters were an essential tool. Lawyers corresponded with clients and other legal professionals. Clergymen wrote sermons, though not strictly letters, a form of written communication, but also corresponded with their bishops, patrons, and parishioners about church matters, tithes and pastoral concerns. Military and naval officers, like Captain Wentworth or Colonel Brandon, would write dispatches, reports, and, of course, personal letters home from distant postings. Their correspondence often anxiously awaited and carrying news of war, peace, promotion, or peril. But it wasn't all business and duty. Gentlemen also wrote personal letters. Fathers corresponded with sons away at university or on the grand tour, offering advice solicited or otherwise, inquiring about their studies, and perhaps gently reminding them of their financial allowances. You can almost picture a long-suffering father in a quiet study somewhere in England. Perhaps even here on a late Monday evening like this one on May 19th. 2025 in Hanoi? If he were a diplomat, composing a letter to his errant son in Italy, saying less carousing with artists, more attention to your Cicero, if you please. Brothers wrote to brothers, sharing news, commiserating over shared annoyances, or planning sporting pursuits. Letters between male friends could be witty, erudite, and deeply affectionate, discussing everything from literature and philosophy to horses and hunting. This brings us to a quirky tidbit, the tradition of the grand tour letter. Young gentlemen of means often undertook an extensive tour of Europe as a finishing touch to their education. They were expected to write lengthy, descriptive letters home to their families, detailing their observations on art, architecture, ancient ruins, foreign customs, and the notable personages they encountered. These letters were often intended for wider circulation among family and friends, serving as a sort of travelogue and a testament to the young man's improving mind and cultivated taste. Of course, they probably omitted some of the less educational or more scandalous misadventures that inevitably occurred. Other distinctly masculine topics included detailed accounts of sporting activities, a successful day's shooting, the thrill of a fox hunt, the outcome of a horse race, or a highly anticipated boxing match. When it came to expressing emotion, the style of men's letters could vary. While the stereotype might be of a more reserved, less effusive tone compared to some contemporary women's correspondence, this wasn't universally true. Many men expressed deep affection for their families and friends, or profound grief or joy, quite openly in their letters. However, societal expectations of manliness undoubtedly played a role. Historians of masculinity and correspondence continue to examine the extent to which these expectations influence the emotional expression or suppression thereof in men's personal letters during this period. Sometimes, great feeling was conveyed through understatement. You might read a letter from a father to his son, seemingly quite formal, but the underlying pride or concern would be palpable to a discerning reader. A gentleman's letter expressing profound grief at the death of his most loyal hound might consist of only two terse sentences, one of which was about the unseasonably warm weather, but you could still feel the depth of his sorrow. Letters exchanged between young men at school or university, much like today, were probably filled with complaints about the food, gossip about their tutors, elaborate plans for future mischief, and deeply philosophical ponderings on why ancient Greek verbs were so very irregular and generally tiresome. So, while the subject matter and perhaps some stylistic conventions differed, the act of letter writing was just as integral to a gentleman's life as it was to a lady's. It was his means of managing his affairs, participating in public life, maintaining his social and intellectual connections, and expressing his personal attachments. From the weighty matters of state to the shared joke with an old friend, the gentleman's hand, like the lady's, found in the letter a versatile and indispensable tool for navigating his world. You've now followed the journey of a gentleman's correspondence in our previous section, seeing how his quill moved from matters of estate and politics to perhaps more personal, if sometimes reserved, exchanges. Whether penned by a man or a woman, a governess or a grand lady, once a letter had been received, read, and perhaps reread several times, as we saw in Section 9 what then became of these precious, ink-filled sheets, in an age before digital archives or cloud storage. The physical act of keeping letters safe, of treasuring important correspondence, was a significant and often sentimental practice. Letters, especially those from loved ones, those carrying significant news, or those that simply captured a moment in time, were not typically discarded with the casualness we might toss junk mail today. A mainstream historical fact is that important or cherished letters were often carefully preserved, becoming tangible records of relationships and personal histories. One of the most common methods was to tie them into bundles, often with a piece of silk ribbon or simple string. You can imagine a character in an Austen novel, perhaps Anne Elliot, retrieving a bundle of Captain Wentworth's early letters. The ribbon faded, the paper softened with handling, to reread his words from a time before their painful separation. Each bundle would be a little time capsule, holding voices from the past. For more organized storage or for particularly valued correspondence, people used letter cases. These could be simple leather pouches or more elaborate wooden or papier-mâché boxes, sometimes beautifully decorated, designed to hold a collection of letters neatly. A lady might have a special letter case on her writing desk, specifically for correspondence from her dearest friends or family. Gentlemen, too, would have their methods for organizing important papers, whether in dedicated compartments within their large library desks or in sturdy deed boxes. Portable writing desks, or lap desks as they were often called, also played a key role. These ingenious wooden boxes, often beautifully crafted with brass fittings and lined with velvet or leather, contained compartments not only for quills, ink, paper, as we explored in Section 2, and sealing wax, but also dedicated slots for storing both incoming and outgoing letters. When closed, they provided a secure and portable repository for one's correspondence, ready to be taken on a journey or simply moved from room to room. It was your mobile office and personal archive, all in one. Finding an ancestor's well-used writing box, perhaps with a hidden compartment still containing a forgotten letter, is like discovering their private social media feed, but with far better grammar and probably more references to the weather or the price of tea. For very important correspondence, particularly business letters, legal documents, or sometimes even significant family letters that one might want to refer back to. Some individuals kept copies. Before the invention of carbon paper or photocopiers, this meant painstakingly handwriting a duplicate of an outgoing letter into a bound letter book. This created a permanent record, an invaluable resource for tracking agreements, instructions, or simply recalling what one had previously written on a particular matter. It was a laborious process, but for matters of consequence, essential. The act of rereading old letters was a common pastime, a way to reconnect with absent friends, relive happy memories, or reflect on past events. In the quiet of an evening, perhaps by the fireside, you might untie a bundle of letters from a beloved sibling or a friend from your school days. The faint scent of old paper and dried ink would fill the air, the familiar handwriting a welcome sight. The bittersweet joy of rereading youthful declarations of eternal friendship, or perhaps even old love letters and wondering, did I truly use that many exclamation points in my description of the county ball? And who on earth was that Algernon I mentioned so frequently? This brings us to a quirky and sometimes controversial aspect of preserving letters, the practice of editing, or even destroying a correspondence after a person's death. Family members, often with the best of intentions, might go through the deceased's letters and remove or obliterate passages, or burn entire collections, to protect their reputation, to manage their public image, or simply to keep intensely private matters from becoming public knowledge. Jane Austen's own letters famously underwent this process at the hands of her devoted sister Cassandra, who, it is believed, destroyed many letters and censored others to present a particular image of her beloved Jane to posterity. The motivations behind the selective preservation or destruction of personal correspondence by families in the 18th and 19th centuries are complex and much discussed by biographers and historians. Balancing a desire to protect cherished privacy against what we might now see as an invaluable historical record. It's a poignant reminder that what survives for us to read today is often a curated version of the past. Another charming way letters were sometimes preserved, or at least their choicest parts, was in friendship albums or commonplace books. A young lady might meticulously copy out a particularly witty verse from a friend's letter, a beautiful sentiment, or a clever observation into a personal album, creating a scrapbook of treasured words and thoughts from her circle. It was a way of immortalizing the highlights of her correspondence. The sheer volume of letters accumulated over a lifetime could be considerable. Imagine the attics and storerooms of old family homes, filled with boxes and trunks of these bundled missives. Their house wasn't just a home. It was a carefully curated, if somewhat flammable, archive of generations of thoughts, news, and relationships, just waiting for a curious descendant or a diligent historian to uncover them. Even as I sit here in Hanoi in 2025 writing this script, which will be digitally stored and easily replicated with no physical decay, it's fascinating to think of the conscious effort and physical space required to preserve those tangible paper records of the past. So these letters were more than just ephemeral communications. They were cherished objects, imbued with sentimental value, carefully stored, and frequently revisited. They were the threads that wove together the narrative of a life, the tangible evidence of connections maintained across distance and time. Each bundle a quiet testament to the enduring power of the written word. You've now carefully bundled and stored your treasured correspondence, at least in your mind's eye, those ribbon-tied packets holding so many memories and emotions, as we pictured in our last section. For centuries, this gentle art of letter writing, with all its rituals and nuances, flourished as the primary means of personal communication across distances. But, like all things, its dominance eventually began to wane, the ink slowly fading on an entire era of epistolary culture. Tonight, in our final exploration before we drift off, we reflect on why this art form slowly receded and consider the enduring words and legacies it has left behind for us. The decline of traditional, lengthy, handwritten correspondence was a gradual process, spurred on by the relentless march of technological innovation in the later 19th and 20th centuries. A key mainstream historical fact here is the introduction of the uniform penny post in Great Britain in 1840. This revolutionary reform, championed by Rowland Hill, made postage affordable for almost everyone by standardizing the cost to a single penny for a letter under a certain weight, prepaid by the sender using the world's first adhesive postage stamp, the penny black. Initially, this massively increased the volume of letters being sent. Suddenly, correspondence wasn't just for the gentry, working-class families too could afford to keep in touch. So, in one sense, the art became even more widespread. However, the very same Victorian era that democratized letter writing also sowed the seeds of its eventual transformation. The invention and spread of the electric telegraph from the mid-19th century onwards offered a previously unimaginable speed of communication. Suddenly, urgent news didn't have to wait for the mail coach as relatively speedy as it was, which we discussed in Section 7. A brief message could be transmitted across hundreds, then thousands of miles in mere minutes or hours. Arriving Tuesday, stop. Bring biscuits. Stop. The terse, economical language of the telegram became the new standard for rapid updates. So much for the elegant, multi-page prose we admired earlier. Then came the telephone. Patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. Though it took time to become a household item, the ability to speak directly to someone far away began to further erode the necessity for some types of letters, particularly those conveying immediate personal news or facilitating quick discussions. Why write a lengthy letter when you could simply pick up the receiver and hear a loved one's voice? Each new technology chipped away at one of the core functions that letters had so capably served for centuries. As the 20th century progressed, with the advent of airmail speeding up international correspondence, and then the personal computer, email, and the internet in its latter decades, the shift accelerated dramatically. The effort of handwriting a letter, addressing it, sealing it, and taking it to the post, which we detailed in sections 2, 3, and 6, began to seem slow and cumbersome compared to the instant gratification of an email or, later, a text message or a social media update. Cultural historians continue to discuss whether this shift from handwritten letters to more immediate forms of communication has fundamentally altered the depth and thoughtfulness of personal exchanges, or simply changed its mode of expression. Are we less reflective or just reflecting more quickly and in shorter bursts? It's a poignant thought, especially as I sit here late in the evening on May 19th. 2025 in Hanoi, Vietnam, crafting this script digitally, knowing it will reach you, wherever you are in the world, almost instantaneously through the very technologies that superseded the handwritten letter. The contrast is stark. Our modern archives are more likely to be gigabytes on a hard drive or cloud server, perhaps filled with saved emails, screenshots of messages, and folders of digital photos, rather than physical bundles of ribbon-tied paper. The romance, some might argue, is somewhat diminished, though the human need to connect and record remains. Our descendants might not find our faded love letters, but they might stumble upon a very confusing string of emojis and archived memes. Yet, despite its decline as the primary mode of personal long-distance communication, the legacy of that gentle art endures in many ways. Our language is still peppered with phrases and conventions that have their roots in letter-writing etiquette, dear sir, madam. Yours sincerely, it's P.S. The very idea of thoughtful but composed communication, of taking the time to articulate one's thoughts clearly and consider one's audience, is a valuable inheritance, even if we now apply it to an email or a carefully worded social media post. Imagine Jane Austen, with her sharp wit and keen social observation, trying to condense her insights into the character limit of Twitter. The shade would be legendary, but oh, the potential frustration for her. The letters from Jane Austen's era, those that have been preserved, remain invaluable historical documents. They offer intimate glimpses into the daily lives, social customs, personal relationships, and a mainstream historical fact. The letters from Jane Austen's era provide invaluable primary source material for historians studying the social, economic, and cultural life of the period, offering insights not always found in more formal documents. But of course, the literary use of letters, as perfected by Austen and other novelists, continues to inspire storytellers. Perhaps one quirky, final flourish of the old epistolary art, before speed truly became king, was the Victorian fascination with the language of flowers or other symbolic codes that could be embedded within letters or accompanying small gifts of pressed flora. It was a last gasp of elaborate, sentimental meaning-making in a rapidly modernizing world. And even as telegraphs and telephones took over for urgent news, letters retained their importance for more reflective, personal, or official communication for a long time, especially in wartime during the 20th century, when a letter from home was a precious link to a world away from the conflict. So, while the ink may have faded on countless missives from that era, and the practice itself has largely been supplanted, the enduring words and the spirit of connection they embodied still resonate. The care, the thought, the anticipation, the joy, the sorrow, all the human emotions that were poured onto those pages, remind us of a time when communication was a more deliberate and perhaps a more cherished act. And now, as our gentle journey through the art of correspondence in Jane Austen's England draws to its natural close, let the soft cadence of these fading thoughts guide you towards a peaceful rest. The world of quills and wax seals, of mail coaches and cross letters, now recedes into the quiet mists of history. A charming landscape for your mind to wander through as you drift deeper into sleep. Imagine the soft rustle of paper, the distant echo of a post horn, the hushed anticipation of a letter being opened by candlelight. These gentle arts, born of a desire to connect across the miles, remind us of the enduring human need to share our lives, our thoughts, our hearts. Though the methods may change with time, that fundamental desire remains a constant, a silken thread running through all our stories. Let the peace of that bygone era settle over you, and may your dreams be filled with the elegance and quiet grace of a world where every carefully chosen word was a treasure. End of script. Sweet dreams.